That's my title. You will be an old maid, and that's so dreadful. Single or unmarried women in Austen's novels. And so as you can see from the picture, there is an actual word for fear of staying single, though I think they jumped the gun a bit. In Jane Austen's era, this was an apprehension based on reality, on the part of young women, of course, not men. What will become of me if I don't marry? Because marriage was the only legitimate career, if that's the word, for a woman in this era. Without marriage, she had little status and no role of any consequence in society. In the worst case scenario, she might find herself destitute. Now, in Austen's time, it was a truism that marriage was a woman's pleasantest preservative from want, however uncongenial the husband. Austen says this when telling the reader why Charlotte Lucas accepts Mr. Collins, and let us remind ourselves of who she married. Isn't he lovely? Now, here's the passage in chapter 22 of the novel, which I'll read at length because it is such a telling summary of the plight of the single woman in Austen's time. Now, Austen tells us first that the whole Lucas family were properly overjoyed at the news of the engagement. Note that word, properly. Charlotte herself was tolerably composed. She had gained her point and had time to consider of it. Her reflections were in general satisfactory. Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary. But still he would be her husband. Without thinking highly of either men or of matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only honourable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune. And however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. This preservative she had now obtained, and at the age of 27, without having ever been handsome, she felt all the good luck of it. She was lucky. She really was. For as I said, if you're unmarried, you had no status in the society of that era, and moreover, as Jane Austen herself observed once, single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor, which is one very strong argument in favour of matrimony. Women generally were extremely disadvantaged in every sense, every legal sense particularly, in this era, and single women particularly so. Love and work, work and love, are the cornerstones of our humanness, Freud is alleged to have said. But for women, love was so much a matter of chance, I think probably harder than finding love online today, and work was denied them. So today I want to look at what Austen's life and times and her novels tell us about this. So to begin with, I mentioned status, and we need first of all to look at the legal status of women generally at this time and long afterwards. So this was her legal status. To put it broadly, a woman belonged to a man. She actually did belong to a man. First to her father from her birth, or on marriage to her husband. And it was these men in her life, and any family males like her brothers, who determined the limits of her behaviour. Who giveth this woman to this man? In the Anglican marriage service is symbolic of this. The father hands her over to the husband. Now I doubt that's used very often today, but interestingly, when Kate Middleton and Prince William married in 2011, the Archbishop of Canterbury used that phrase in the marriage service, and Kate's father gave his daughter's hand to the Archbishop, who placed it in Prince William's. So they went for tradition. Legally, a woman was not an independent entity. She had no independent existence. She was a property. And this wasn't just custom, it was enshrined in law. Marriage meant that two people became one, the husband. That is, the wife had no individual personhood, let alone autonomy. She didn't exist as a person. So if a woman owned property or money on marriage, it was transferred to the husband, as will happen when Emma marries Mr. Knightley, and obviously once her father's dead. If a woman who was well off didn't marry, she was actually in a better position if she didn't marry. Now, there were other disadvantages. Married women were unable to draft wills. Any money that came to them by whatever means was by default their husband's. And as we know from our novel reading, sometimes a conscientious father, through the marriage settlement, would make sure that the pin money a woman was to have when married, that is the money she had for her own use, that was specified, or set up a trust for subsequent children, or make sure that the jointure, that is what a woman would have if widowed, if her husband died, that the jointure would be generous. And I think Mrs. Jennings in Sense and Sensibility is a good example of this. And proposed marriages could founder on these discussions and not take place after all. Now, of course, your dowry was also tied to this, hence the despondency of females with a very poor dowry, women like the Bennet or the Dashwood sisters. Remember the opening of Mansfield Park. Miss Maria Ward of Huntingdon, with only £7,000, had the good luck to captivate Sir Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park. All Huntingdon exclaimed on the greatness of the match, and her uncle the lawyer himself allowed her to be at least £3,000 short of any equitable claim to it. Now, it sounds like Austen's being facetious, but she's not. What this means is that to catch a baronet, you would be expected to have a £10,000 dowry. It was an actuarial decision. And in the next issue of Sensibilities, you'll find a very interesting article by an actuary who says that Jane Austen is the greatest actuarial novelist of all. And he particularly loves Sense and Sensibility, but anyway, you can look forward to that. In Maria Ward's case, Sir Thomas was obviously besotted enough, or today we'd say sexually attracted enough, to waive the economic consideration that he was entitled to. And that is why Austen says Maria Ward had the good luck to captivate him. There's that word luck again. Now, embedded in all of Austen's novels are allusions to money. It is ironic that she's been canonised in recent years as a romantic novelist, when she is the supreme realist, acutely conscious of the significance to women's lives of money or the lack of it. The poet W.H. Auden recognised this. "It makes me most uncomfortable to see," he wrote, "an English spinster of the middle class describe the amorous effects of brass, reveal so frankly and with such sobriety the economic basis of society." Now, of course, some women in this era did work. Working women, working class women have always worked. But a gentlewoman didn't work unless she was reduced to working. And there the possibilities, of course, were narrow. Governess, or the sale of human intellect, as Jane Fairfax puts it, lady's companion, or as we see in Persuasion, Mrs. Smith, eking out a bit of cash by sewing once she falls on hard times. If a woman did work, of course, as I said, anything she earned belonged to her husband. So the earnings of a married woman novelist, for example, would be her husband's. And if she had copyright of her own works before marriage, the copyright would pass to him. Now, this means that if Jane Austen had married this man, Mr. Harris Bigwither, when he proposed to her in 1802, and I'll come to that in a minute, and managed to continue to write novels between babies, her income would not have been her income at all. And we know that she got a big thrill out of earning her own money, as her letters tell us. when Sense and Sensibilities sells all its copies, she tells brother Frank that I have now therefore ridden myself into £250. Amazingly, if you look that up, it's around £10,000 to £11,000 today. Anyway, she goes on, which only makes me long for more. I can't imagine that being a major consideration with Austen, but it may have been one of the considerations she lay awake thinking about on the night of the 2nd of December 1802, after she'd accepted Big Wither's proposal and got up to change her mind the next morning, to great embarrassment all round. It's particularly interesting that she did change her mind. I think it's very significant because I'd like to think it's a robust determination against whatever odds to keep her independence and so keep writing. She chose to continue an old maid. Now I'll return to Austen herself in a moment, but first let's have a look at how old maids were generally regarded in Austen's own time, and it's not, thankfully, a term you hear any longer, although it was certainly around in my youth. Oh, she's an old maid, she was left on the shelf. So, old maid. The term old maid is a derogatory one. A man did not choose you. You were, as I said, left on the shelf. However, it also has a sexual implication. A maid, after all, is a virginal young woman. So old maid implies that a woman has aged without any experience of sex, and that fact apparently invited derision. The term old maid was, as I said, a derogatory one for a very long time, and what's happening there in that picture is she's an old maid. You can see what's happening upstairs. Now she knows what's going on. The servant is having a nice time with her young man, and so she gets up and says, "Oh, I'm sure I can smell fire." Obsessed with sex, you see. So the old maid was a stock character in early 18th century fiction and before. In fact, the Oxford English Dictionary traces it back to the 1530s, and I was amazed to find that my 2008 edition of the Macquarie Dictionary still has old maid as a term, with a definition of that same rather derisive meaning. And it's not just derogatory, but something a bit more sinister. In the 18th century, consistently linked to cat ownership is the older single woman, usually portrayed with warts and a burgeoning moustache. That is the old maid. Old maids at a cat's funeral. Look at them. That's what that is. Old maids at a cat's funeral. That's all they can do, nothing much to interest them. Now, as one writer has observed, anything that detracted from a woman devoting her life to making men happy was perceived as a threat to the very fabric of society. Where might it end if women no longer looked to their husbands for affection but sought comfort from pets instead? This bowel-churning prospect for the Georgian male was something that needed stamping out, and what better way to do this than ridicule? The subliminal message was, spending your affection unwisely, i.e. not dedicated to men, led to a lonely, unfulfilled life. And cats had a bad press anyway, unlike that of the faithful hound. Cats were portrayed as treacherous, self-interested and vicious. Moreover, their reputation was still suffering from the belief of previous eras that cats were linked to witchcraft and devil worship, the familiar of witches, and perhaps therefore an incarnation of the devil. That's the reason for the blackness of the cat. As you can see, that connection of the old maid and the devil is also there in this next sketch and verse. A mid-19th century, would you believe it, humorous Valentine. Old and ugly, mean and stupid, what a chance you are for Cupid. Die when you may, the truth I tell, old Beelzebub will toll the bell. Though men have long o'erlooked your charms, you'll feel old Satan's glowing arms. You couldn't make it up, could you? So note here not merely the contempt, the derision, but the misogyny of this verse. Readers of Georgette Heyer's Regency novels will have come across another term which was in common use in Georgian and Regency times. You find it in her books. A pleader, a derogatory term for an old maid. What did it refer to? According to the 1811 Dictionary in the Vulgar Tongue, it refers to the belief that for women who do not marry, the punishment after death for neglecting to increase and multiply will be leading apes in hell. Old maids are also fair game in other ways. In Hogarth's famous 18th century cartoon series, The Rake's Progress, we have one cartoon showing the dissolute young man prepared to marry a rich old maid for her money, having probably gambled away all of his own. And now this next one is one of my favourites. That is Prime Minister Pitt smooching the Bank of England dressed entirely in £1 notes, and because he wants more money to continue his wars against Napoleon. And she's saying, oh, rape, murder, rape, have I kept myself, what does she say, have I kept myself, whatever, for this. That's, as I said, one of my favourites. So that picks up on the idea of the mean, rich old spinster. She's just sitting on her money, not doing anything useful for it, like giving it to a man or spending it on him. Now, even at the beginning of the 20th century, now this is really pretty challenging. When the women's suffrage movement turned radical, this derogatory idea of the old maid was so powerful, it was harnessed to denigrate the type of women who would become a suffragette. See, once again, the connection with sex. Never been kissed. They wouldn't be interested in having a vote if they had a man. Oh. So given this general view of the old maid, coupled with women's legal and economic disadvantaged status at this time, you could begin to understand why marriage, even apart from economic considerations, was so important to a woman. How important just to their self-esteem alone, and the difficult and often traumatic plight of women who did not marry. Now, in the Watsons, Austen's unfinished 1804 novel featuring 4 unmarried sisters, Elizabeth says, I think she's the eldest, says, I could do very well single for my own part. Like, she feels self-sufficient. She's quite happy being single. But my father cannot provide for us, and it's very bad to grow old and be poor and laughed at. As Joanne Wilkes in a recent paper for JASA says, this is the bleakest of Austen's 4 unfinished texts. It's possible, she continued, that Austen abandoned this manuscript because the Watson daughter's situation suddenly became too like her own after her father died in 1805, so shortly after. However, as we know, all of Jane Austen's finished novels end with a marriage. Yes. I don't need to tell you who those people are, do I? No. This is what is known as a happy ending, and today we tend to understand it in totally romantic terms. Pride and Prejudice, for example, has been described as the greatest love story ever written. But that's not really what Austen meant as an early 19th century writer, shaped by 18th century rationalism and by her knowledge of the realism of women's lives. The happy ending in Austen's novels, as her contemporary readership would have understood, is that the heroines managed to get married. Not that they found their perfect other half, though of course that is a bonus. They are saved from being old maids and all that that implies. And of course there may be love on both sides, but the union is not just about this. And I think this needs to be emphasised to point up the significance of being married as opposed to simply making a romantic union with the man of your dreams and having a fairy tale wedding. And I think it's important to understand the distinction if we are to understand Austen's novels. To not make assumptions out of our contemporary attitudes, which really happens too much today. Today, an unmarried woman has many choices, unlike in Austen's time. We can afford to focus on finding the perfect mate, and good luck with that. In Charlotte Lucas's time, that was a luxury that few could afford. Well, now let's move on to Jane Austen herself and consider her without her novelist's hat, that is, simply as an unmarried woman and an old maid. She was an old maid, a woman without personal or economic independence, subject to the wishes of a male relative. In her case, her father, the Reverend George Austen, who, with his wife, Jane's mother, decided in December 1800 to leave Steventon and move to Bath. Jane was not consulted, but nor would she have been expected to be consulted. She was 25, or near to, and Steventon was her beloved home, offering her everything she most enjoyed. The countryside and walks in it, friends and neighbours of longstanding, peace and quiet to write. Her brother James and his wife Mary were to take over the rectory and James the living, and incidentally retain much of the family possessions, some of which would have been loved by her. Mary was there when Jane was told on returning from a visit to friends about the move, and reported later that Jane was greatly distressed. And there can be no doubt it was a terrible shock to Jane and a decision that was most unwelcome. And I think it's always said, oh, she didn't like Bath, because they moved to Bath. I think it's more that she disliked the idea of living in a town. She knew it wasn't nourishing to her spirit. And what happens in the following 8 or so years, I think, proves this. Jane Austen must have been somewhat depressed during those years, what in her time would have been described as suffering from lowness of spirits. Now, she didn't necessarily show this in her everyday life. I mean, 18th century manners frowned on dumping your feelings on other people. We see that in Sense and Sensibility. It's not good manners. It's inconsiderate of others. But in some deep core of herself, she was, perhaps a better word is, repressed. And in fact, in Deirdre Lefay's collection of her extant letters, there's a big gap between May 1801 and September 1804. Now remember, Cassandra burned many of her letters. What did she say to her sister in this silent period, one wonders? As Claire Tomlin in her biography of Austen says, anyone arriving at their 25th birthday with 3 outstanding novels to their name looks well embarked on the road to success. Fame, riches, happiness, all within easy reach, you would think. Everything was set for her to put in a little more work, perhaps on the 3 manuscripts, find a publisher who understood his trade, and start on a new novel. This did not happen. Instead, she felt silent. For 10 years, she produced almost nothing. And not until she was nearly 35, in the summer of 1809, did she return to the working pattern of her early 20s. That is, when the cottage at Chawton, a settled home at last in the country, was offered to the 3 Austen women, Jane, Cassandra and Mrs. Austen. Just imagine what we might have had from Austen had that hiatus not occurred. If she had not been uprooted in every sense of the word at the age of 25, or if Edward had only offered the cottage much earlier. And you do have to wonder what was stopping him, what took him so long. It would have saved Jane, her mother and her sister from those unsettled and peripatetic years after her father died. And you can see here how crucial was the dependence of women on men. Their lives really were controlled altogether by men. Now, those feelings about living in Bath were perhaps partly what made Jane Austen initially accept that proposal I mentioned in December 1802. She'd been living in Bath for nearly 2 years, and the proposal came from an old family friend, Harris Bigwither, whom she'd known for much of her life and who was now 21 and the heir to a considerable estate. Jane was about to turn 27. The Austen young women were very friendly with Harris's sisters, Alethea and Elizabeth, and at the time of the proposal they were on a visit to the girls' home, Manydown House, in the neighbourhood of Steventon. Harris proposed to Jane on the evening of the 2nd of December 1802, and she must have been tempted by the possibilities of a change in her status because she said yes. Imagine the congratulations in the evenings, probably champagne was opened, or Constantia wine perhaps. Now, when I say she must have been tempted, I don't mean tempted by affluence, though she would be the mistress of a large Hampshire house and estate, but she'd be near friends and neighbours, could provide for her parents, perhaps have Cassandra to live with her, and Harris would probably have been a pleasant husband. It's always said that she changed her mind because she realised that nevertheless she couldn't marry without love, and we can't discount that. Surely has something to do with it, for, as she said in a letter to her niece Fanny Knight in 1814, anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. But it could be also that she wondered whether, even if now, with a settled home in her familiar countryside, if she did not love Harris, if the baby started coming, she would in fact be able to write, living with a man who was not a kindred spirit and who, no matter how kind and liberal, would legally be her master. Perhaps she would not feel free to write, not because he prevented her, but because the situation again did not nourish her, just as living in Bath didn't. So, as I said earlier, she changed her mind the next morning and accepted her lot, which did not get any easier. Reverend George Austen died in 1805, only 4 years after the move to Bath, and so, of course, did his small annuity. So the circumstances of the women he left behind were very much reduced. Jane's brothers, none of them except Edward very well off, pitched in to contribute a small but adequate amount for them to live on. In Bath, as I've said, the three women moved into progressively more modest, less congenial, noisier lodgings, and eventually, in July 1806, went to share a house with Brother Frank's new wife, Mary Gibson, in Southampton. Again, an economy measure proposed by Frank himself because he would often be away at sea. And so it went until Brother Edward, not before time, offered a cottage on one of his estates to his mother and sisters. Now, another strain of the old maid idea that we have to look at is what we might call Jane Austen as an old maid writer. She didn't marry, she remained an old maid, and until quite recently, this was used to claim that her view of the world could only be a narrow one. Her brother Henry perhaps started this when he wrote his biographical notice of her in 1818, in which he portrays her as a good, kind, Christian spinster aunt. This was a view that the Victorians embellished, for it suited their view of women, and you can see it in the portrait of Jane Austen that accompanied the memoir published in 1870 by her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, all prettied up to conform to Victorian ideals of sweetness and docility. And I love that the way they've placed the photos on that cover, because it looks as if Jane Austen's looking really askance. Who's that? Look Look at the contrast. And in his memoir, James Edward stated confidently that of events her life was singularly barren, i.e. as she was, this sort of implied. Few changes and no great crises ever broke the smooth current of its course. Now, as another great writer, Hilary Mantel, has observed of this statement, non-writers would not know exactly what, in a writer's life, a crisis might look like. In fact, what I said earlier about her depression or repression in Bath shows us exactly what a crisis in a writer's life looks like. But later writers continued that dear, limited Aunt Jane reading of Austen for quite a long time. The passions are perfectly unknown to her, said Charlotte Bronte, but how little she understood Austen. For anyone who has read Austen with attention knows that these novels were not written by a woman who had never been in love or a woman who did not understand sexual attraction. I remember Andrew Davies, who wrote the screenplay for Pride and Prejudice. He said that his aim in the screenplay was to convey that the whole story is powered by Darcy's sexual attraction to Lizzie. He wants her, and that's what all the action's about. That is a really, I mean, he always exaggerates, he has to put sex into everything, but even so, I think that it's an interesting point, that how could she have written those novels? She knew what she was talking about. That is one strand of thinking about our old maid author, and it did affect assessment of the value of her novels. To put it in academic language, for better or worse, Austen as Old Maid has carried and continues to carry enormous explanatory power. And that quote, by the way, is from the wonderful Austen scholar Devaney Lucer. We should not underestimate that aspect, though, of our author. Now, all right, let's move on to what did Austen say about old maids? Now, the actual term only appears in two of her novels, Pride and Prejudice and Emma. There are two mentions in Pride and Prejudice, and after what I've told you about the status of old maids, surely we can feel sympathy, empathy for Mrs. Bennet, who in her rather vulgar and muddled way is doing her best to preserve her girls from want, with no assistance from their father. When she says at the end, 3 daughters married, I mean, you can really understand, 3 out of 5, she's doing okay. She doesn't have to worry about them anymore. Now, in Pride and Prejudice, one old maid reference is from the airhead Lydia, who pronounces to her 2 older sisters on their return from London after Jane's been staying there and Elizabeth's been staying at Hunsford. Lydia says, I was in great hopes that one of you would have got a husband before you came back. Jane will be quite an old maid soon, I declare. She was almost 23. Lord, how ashamed I should be of not being married before 23. Note her use of the word ashamed, and remember her exultation at being married at 16, flaunting her ring out the window of the carriage. Now, for the other mention of the term in the novel, we must, of course, return to Charlotte Lucas. And we need to return because this is a highly significant mention. It's Austen ensuring we fully understand why she marries such an unattractive prospect as Mr. Collins, and her whole family is properly delighted. Now, Austen also says, and the boys were relieved, that is her brothers, the boys were relieved from their apprehension of Charlotte's dying an old maid. Why relieved? For the reasons I gave earlier about what happened when the Reverend Austen died. After the death of the Lucas parents, it would have fallen to Charlotte's brothers to support their sister financially. So that's another point about being an old maid. She knew she was a burden on others, and her dependency was highlighted and magnified when spinster aunts were expected to be useful at the beck and call of whoever needed them. It was the least they could do to make up for their failure to marry. And I venture to suggest also that in Mansfield Park, Mrs. Norris, Miss Ward that was, the eldest sister of the Ward sisters, married the Reverend Norris in order to avoid becoming an old maid, because it's the way Austen tells us. Early in the first chapter, she says that Miss Ward, at the end of half a dozen years, found herself obliged to be attached to the Reverend Mr. Norris. Obliged. A friend of her brother-in-law with scarcely any private fortune. We always must pay attention to the way Austen tells us something. Felt obliged, because otherwise she would be an old maid. She must be in her late 20s, if it's half a dozen years later, and soon she will be left on the shelf. And Mrs. Norris's psychological twin, in a sense, is Elizabeth Elliot in Persuasion. For Austen tells us that Elizabeth had the consciousness of being 9 and 20 to give her some regrets and some apprehensions. Elizabeth Elliot, though, will be much more demanding in her choice of husband than Miss Ward, and given her dependence on her spendthrift father, she surely faces an uncertain future once he dies, and William Elliot inherits the property. Elizabeth might well be obliged to marry somebody, a much lesser being than she'd hoped, rather than live with her sister Mary Musgrove. Well, what else could she do? Become a governess? I don't feel Elizabeth would have paid much attention to learning when she was a girl. So the other novel, of course, in which the term old maid occurs is Emma, where we have Austen's definitive old maid, Miss Bates. And let's remind ourselves that although we tend to laugh at her rather foolish garrulousness, Jane Austen does not. And her description of Miss Bates does not invite ridicule. Miss Bates, she tells us, who stood in the very worst predicament in the world for having much of the public favour, nevertheless was a woman whom no one named without goodwill. It was her own universal goodwill and contented temper which worked such wonders. So Austen does not participate in that general view of old maids current at her own time, and her description of Miss Bates's character, I think, also tells us what to think about Emma's comments about her, which are often far from kind. It's in this novel that we have the definitive discussion from Austen about being an old maid, which tells you Emma's views, of course, not Austen's. The discussion occurs in that conversation between Emma and Harriet quite early in the book. Harriet starts by wondering that Emma should not be married, so charming as you are, to which Emma replies that there's really no way she could be better off if she married. She's never been in love, not her nature, or her way, and without love, I'm sure I should be a fool to change such a situation as mine, she says, since she lacks neither fortune, employment, or consequence. Now, I think she reveals more perhaps of herself than she would have realised when she says, "Never, never could I expect to be so truly beloved and important, so always first and always right in any man's eyes as I am in my father's." Well, she doesn't convince Harriet, and as I'm sure you realise, she provides the title of my talk. For Harriet cannot get past, but still you will be an old maid, and that is so dreadful. Now Emma now replies to her, "Never mind, Harriet, I shall not be a poor old maid, and it is poverty only which makes celibacy contemptible to a generous public. A single woman with a very narrow income must be a ridiculous, disagreeable old maid, the proper sport of boys and girls. But a single woman of good fortune is always respectable and may be as sensible and pleasant as anybody else. Note the lovely little echo there of Pride and Prejudice. A single woman of good fortune. And I think it's there for a reason. It's more evidence of Emma's immaturity and ignorance of life, because she's claiming here parity with men. An unmarried woman is just as well positioned as any man, but she's not. If Mr. Knightley had married somebody else, Jane Fairfax, for example, or anybody else, Emma would soon have found her consequence greatly diminished. Except to her father, it would be Mr. Knightley's wife who would be the woman of first consequence in Highbury, with Emma a poor second. She wouldn't really have much of a role anymore. And if you are not a romantic, you might wonder whether this is the real reason that Emma accepts Mr. Knightley's proposal, even if it's a deeply unconscious one. Look what Austen says about it. Shocked at the thought that Mr. Knightley might marry Harriet, it darted through her with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Knightley must marry nobody but herself. Now, isn't that an interesting way of putting it? She takes his role. He must marry her. Not she realised she loved Mr. Knightley, not it shot through her with the speed of an arrow that she must marry Mr. Knightley. And I think we cannot afford to ignore the way she tells us, just as we can't with the other examples I quoted. Well, okay, finally, let us just briefly consider that in 3 of the novels, there are 3 significant young women who very nearly didn't marry the man they wanted, and so would have remained old maids. Anne Elliot has condemned herself to the unmarried state forever, for she will marry no one but Frederick Wentworth. She already had one proposal from Charles Musgrove. She turned it down. But what if Frederick hadn't returned? What if he'd returned a married man? It's quite a lot of time since they last met. And what about Fanny Price? Had Edmund Bertram not realised that of course she was the one he should marry? She also would not have married anybody but Edmund, and it's only by default, after all, that he finally sees her. And it's pretty wishy-washy. Austen tells us it might be, he suddenly realised, or he eventually realised, not suddenly, eventually realised it might be a hopeful undertaking to persuade Fanny that her warm and sisterly regard for him would be foundation enough for wedded love. Now, he doesn't say that he loved Fanny Price either. It's not exactly passion. So here we have, I think there's always irony associated with marriage and romance in Austen's novels. As if she's saying, don't get too carried away. There's always 2 sides to a question. Finally, what about Jane Fairfax? A young woman whose beloved cannot be relied on to deliver on his promise of marriage. Now, when we first meet Jane on her return to Highbury, we're told she has a slight appearance of ill health. It's only much later we discover why. She is enduring great apprehension and anxiety about Frank Churchill's intentions. Frank, when he arrives, does everything possible to create a smokescreen, but only manages to increase her anxiety exponentially. And it shows in her failing health, which is emotional as much as physical. Again, Jane Austen's extraordinary psychological understanding. Part of Jane's distress is her knowledge that unless she marries, she must seek employment as a governess. Indeed, when Colonel Campbell takes her into his family as a little girl, the plan was that she should be brought up for educating others. Now, this is a fate that, as I quoted before, Jane as an adult compares to slavery, the sale not quite of human flesh but of human intellect. And Austen then spells out quite vividly how Jane feels about her fate. For after her friend Miss Campbell marries, with the fortitude of a devoted novitiate, Jane had resolved at 21 to complete the sacrifice and retire from all the pleasures of life, of rational intercourse, equal society, peace and hope, to penance and mortification forever. Those are very strong words. Well, Jane doesn't pursue a situation despite the best efforts of Mrs. Elton. She obviously hopes it won't be necessary, and the day is saved, as is Jane, when Frank's aunt, Mrs. Churchill, dies. Jane Fairfax, I think, is one of Austen's most interesting characters, and she is potentially a tragic one, had Frank not come good. She's obviously an extremely sensitive young woman. And Frank, we feel, was not prepared to come good for as long as it might jeopardise his inheritance. After the Box Hill fiasco, where Emma is so cruel to Miss Bates, Mr. Knightley, in reprimanding her, reminds her that Miss Bates is poor. She has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. He sums up succinctly the fate of many an old maid. In this case, you know he will attempt to cushion Miss Bates's fate as best he can, but not all women in Austen's era were so fortunate. Thank you. But just to finish on a light note,
Love it. Thank you so much, Joanne. I love the cat theme and such an interesting and thought-provoking talk. Does anyone have questions they'd like to ask?
Characters that try and avoid becoming the old maid, like or the Steele sisters. I mean, they're actually not necessarily portrayed as an admirable characters, trying to a particular fate for themselves. So I just wondered whether you have any comment on that.
well, I think Austen, in a sense, didn't take sides. She thought, well, just because there's that stereotype of the old maid, it doesn't mean I can't portray. Anne and Lucy Steele, they're not attractive, are they? But if they were married women, they wouldn't be attractive either, probably. So I think it's just that she always paints a wide canvas of characters and she's not making any particular point about them. But you're right, of course, there are other unmarried women and she doesn't always have anything to say about them. But
just thinking about Mrs. Clay, who obviously was married but then now isn't.
widowed, yeah.
Widowed, yes.
Well, I've always felt that she was really gambling if she was making up to William Elliot. I mean, she was hoping he'd marry her. But you have to wonder, but what is it saying? She was desperate and she thought she might be able to land him? Well, I mean, there's a whole panorama of women in rather desperate situations. She presumably is dependent on her father, but when he dies, what happens? You have to try and marry again.
Was the marrying of the daughters always the mother's preoccupation?
No.
Not much evidence in Austen of the fathers getting involved.
Oh, we've had talks in the past on fathers in Jane Austen. They never come off looking terribly good. I think only in Northanger Abbey do we have a rather responsible father in the Reverend Morland. All the other fathers are a bit lacking, or, just not very responsible. Well, it's a dreadful idea. And he certainly wouldn't do anything to further it. And in fact, he's also just completely resigned his role as a parent. So, Emma's been the parent. So, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes. What is the status of Mr. Darcy's aunt?
Lady Catherine's widowed.
What is her status?
I think she says at one stage that our family didn't believe in entail, doesn't she? So all the money was hers, and presumably then Anne's, her daughters. the money would pass down. So I guess estates weren't always entailed.
And Mrs. Dashwood's isn't either. Sorry, Mrs. Ferrers. Horrible Mrs. Ferrers.
Oh, horrible Mrs.
She's got all
Ferrers.
her money and can leave it as she wants.
As she wants. And the Dashwoods, well, it was dependent on the whim of the old uncle or whatever he was. Yeah, the uncle. So that none of that was entailed. So.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned about wealthy widows in Sense and Sensibility. A phrase that I heard years ago, and I don't know the source of it, comes back to me, the honourable estate of widowhood. And so clearly, you know, if you could marry someone that would enable you to become a wealthy widow, then you were well on the way.
You're probably much better off than when you were single, really. I'll take mine off now.
Well, Joe and I go way back, 6 or 7 decades at Sydney University.
Yeah.
We had mutual friends back then. And then several decades later, I met up with her again in Castle. And when I finally got to join JASA, the first friendly face I saw or familiar was Joe. And so it's been quite delightful. I don't know about you, but while I was sitting there listening to this talk as a baby boomer, and all of you in this audience, I can't help thinking how lucky we are. What we have that Jane never had, and that is choices. We've had so many choices. And we need to be aware of that, and I hope the next generation of young women are aware of what that second generation of feminists gave us, who became young women.
Yes.
Now, I've been charged with the very pleasurable task of saying thank you to Joe.
Thank you, Tony.
Indonesian says thank you in the most beautiful way. So they say terima kasih, accept love.
Oh,
And I'm
lovely.
taking it upon myself on your behalf to ask Jo to accept our love for what she has shared with us today, all those insights, beautifully referenced to Jane's own words, and also the work she does for Sensibilities. But in general, the decades of work that Jo has put into keeping the flame of Jane Austen burning bright. So, Jo, terima kasih.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.